something unprecedented is happening inside Russia's military command structure. Reports suggest that senior generals are pushing back against direct orders from the Kremlin, and it involves NATO strike warnings. This is not just military drama. This could reshape the entire conflict dynamics in Eastern Europe. Kep, welcome back to the channel. I'm Rachel, and today we're diving deep into one of the most significant developments in Russian military politics we've seen in months. Recent intelligence reports and leaked communications suggest a growing rift between Putin's inner circle and senior military commanders over how to respond to NATO's increasingly direct warnings about potential strikes. In this video, we'll break down what actually happened, analyze why this matters far beyond Moscow, and explore what this tells us about the current state of Russia's military leadership. And this is analysis based on available information. Let's separate fact from speculation. To understand why this moment is so significant, we need to step back and look at how we got here. Since the escalation of the Ukraine conflict in 2022, Russia's military command structure has undergone significant stress. What I find particularly interesting is how the traditional Soviet-era hierarchy, where political loyalty often trumped military expertise, has been tested by modern warfare realities. According to multiple defense analysts, there have been at least 3 major purges or reorganizations of Russian military leadership since early 2022. Generals who failed to deliver promised results were removed. But here's the crucial part. They were replaced by commanders who understood modern combined arms warfare better, but who may also be less ideologically compliant. The NATO dimension adds another layer. Over the past 6 months, NATO has shifted from passive support to more active deterrence posturing. In my analysis, this includes forward deployment of additional forces in Poland and the Baltic states, more aggressive intelligence sharing with Ukraine, public warnings about red lines that mirror Russia's own rhetoric, and increased military exercises. What makes the current situation different is that NATO officials, according to reports from European defense sources, have begun communicating potential response scenarios directly through military channels, diplomatic ones. This creates a unique problem for Russian commanders. They're receiving tactical level threat assessments that may conflict with the political messaging coming from the Kremlin. In my perspective, this sets up an inevitable tension. Military professionals think in terms of capabilities and vulnerabilities. Political leaders think in terms of narratives and domestic positioning. When these two mindsets collide during a high-stakes standoff, something has to give. So what exactly are we talking about? Based on reports from multiple intelligence sources and defense journalists with contacts inside Russia's military establishment, here's what appears to have occurred. I know over the past 4 to 6 weeks, senior commanders in Russia's general staff reportedly received intelligence assessments about NATO's readiness to conduct limited precision strikes if certain escalatory thresholds were crossed. According to these reports, the assessments were detailed, including likely targets, probable weapons systems, and estimated Russian response times. Here's where it gets interesting. When presented with draft operational plans that some analysts describe as aggressive forward positioning near NATO borders, at least 3 senior generals reportedly expressed strong reservations. But the consensus is that these commanders argued such moves would be militarily counterproductive and could trigger the exact NATO response Russia claims to want to avoid. And what I find significant is not just the pushback itself, but the reasoning. According to leaked summaries, and we should note these are secondhand accounts, the generals' objections were framed in purely military terms: force readiness, logistic sustainability, defensive vulnerabilities, and capability gaps. Revealing detail. Reports suggest the generals specifically cited Russia's air defense coverage gaps in certain sectors that would be exposed if forces were repositioned as allegedly ordered. Okay, in my analysis, this situation didn't emerge overnight. It's the culmination of at least three converging factors. Factor one, battlefield realities. The ongoing operations in Ukraine have revealed capability limitations that weren't apparent in planning phases. Russian military professionals have had to adapt to realities that political leadership may not fully appreciate. When generals are held accountable for outcomes, they become more vocal about operational feasibility. What I find particularly interesting here is the emergence of what some analysts call a competence paradox. The Kremlin needed effective commanders to improve battlefield performance, but effective commanders are by definition willing to challenge unrealistic expectations. Demblian's Factor 2, NATO's calculated messaging. NATO's approach has been more sophisticated than many realize. By communicating potential response scenarios, they're for or assertions. By communicating potential response scenarios through military-to-military channels, they've essentially been speaking directly to Russian professional soldiers rather than politicians. This creates what I call tactical level deterrence, where the people who would actually execute operations understand the risks more clearly than those ordering them. Dan, according to defense analysts, this isn't unprecedented. During Cold War crises, similar back-channel communications help prevent miscalculations. What's different now is the transparency. NATO has been relatively open about sharing threat assessments with Russian counterparts through various military liaison mechanisms. 3. Internal Russian politics. Here's my perspective on the political dimension. Putin's system has always balanced competing power centers, security services, military political elites, economic oligarchs. When the military performs poorly, it loses influence. But when it's needed for critical decisions, its voice carries more weight. Among the general's reported refusal isn't a coup attempt or even necessarily defiance in the traditional sense. In my analysis, it's more likely a negotiating tactic within Russia's decision-making system. By presenting professional military assessments that contradict political preferences, these commanders are forcing a more realistic conversation about costs and risks. Planja, let's talk about why this matters beyond the immediate drama. Lambda, for NATO and European security, this suggests that Russia's military leadership is currently more cautious than political rhetoric might indicate. That's actually stabilizing in the short term. If professional military voices can constrain politically motivated escalation, the risk of miscalculation decreases. Bland, however, and this is crucial, it also reveals fractures in Russian decision-making coherence. Fractured decision-making can be more unpredictable than unified policy, even if that policy is aggressive. Bland, in my assessment, this situation raises questions about command authority that could affect Russia's operational effectiveness. If political leadership can't count on immediate military compliance, they may hesitate to make time-sensitive decisions. Alternatively, they might bypass professional military advice entirely, which creates different risks. What I find most significant, this could indicate that Russia's military establishment is building institutional memory about the costs of politically driven military operations. That's a potentially moderating long-term factor. We need to be careful about overinterpreting, but throughout history, when military establishments begin questioning political leadership during active conflicts, it changes power dynamics permanently. I'm not suggesting anything as dramatic as a coup. Russia's system has significant safeguards against that, but the balance between military professional judgment and political control may be shifting. Let's look at how different parties are interpreting this. According to reports from defense officials speaking to media outlets, Western intelligence views this as evidence that Russia's military is experiencing command coherence challenges. Some analysts see it as an opportunity, proof that pressure is working. Others view it as a potential instability risk. Unsurprisingly, Russian official sources either deny these reports entirely or frame them as Western disinformation designed to create the appearance of internal division. What's interesting is that the denials themselves vary in strength, suggesting some sensitivity to the narrative. Right? Experts I follow who specialize in Russian military affairs tend to view this as part of ongoing civil-military relations dynamics that have been evolving throughout the conflict. The consensus seems to be that this represents normal friction amplified by high stakes rather than an unprecedented crisis. And here's my take. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Are there tensions between professional military judgment and political directives? Almost certainly. That's normal in any system during wartime. Is this an unprecedented crisis? Probably not. But is it significant enough to affect operational planning and potentially constrain aggressive options? Yes, I think it is. Shand. Now let's dig into the aspects that mainstream coverage often misses. And what I find fascinating about this situation is that it reveals how modern deterrence actually works. NATO isn't just positioning military assets, they're positioning information. By sharing detailed strike scenarios with Russian military professionals, they're essentially weaponizing professional military assessment against political decision-making. Lines, think about it. If you're a Russian general and NATO shares specifics about how they would target your air defense networks, you now have information that makes aggressive posturing look much more costly. You have a professional obligation to factor that into your advice. NATO knows this, which is why they're communicating this way. Blamed in my analysis, this represents a new evolution in deterrence theory, what some call transparent deterrence. Instead of ambiguity about capability, you provide clarity to professional military planners who will then constrain their own political leadership. Here's what often gets overlooked. Military tensions don't exist in a vacuum. Russia's economy is under sustained pressure from sanctions. The military budget is straining to support ongoing operations. Domestic political support, while still substantial, isn't unlimited. Lyon's Russian generals understand logistics and sustainability in ways politicians may not fully appreciate. When they assess whether Russia can sustain a potential confrontation with NATO, they're factoring in ammunition stocks, replacement capacity, personnel availability, and economic endurance. Mind what I find particularly significant, according to economic analysts, Russia's defense industrial base is currently operating near capacity just to maintain current operational tempo. Any significant escalation would require mobilizing additional resources, which has domestic political costs the military leadership is certainly aware of. In my perspective, there's a deeper story here about how Russia's military culture is changing. The Soviet system prioritized political loyalty and ideological commitment. The modern Russian military, particularly after reforms of the Arsene-Ishers, has tried to professionalize and prioritize competence. This creates inherent tension. Professional militaries develop their own internal logic, based on effectiveness, capability, and realistic assessment. When that military logic conflicts with political imperatives, you get exactly what we're seeing now. What mainstream analysis sometimes misses, this isn't necessarily about peace versus war or aggression versus restraint. It's about professional military culture asserting its own criteria for evaluating options. That can be moderating in some contexts, but it can also lead to different kinds of escalation if military professionals believe they have effective options that politicians are hesitating to employ. Let me be clear about the risks. While military pushback against unrealistic political demands can be stabilizing, it can also create dangerous dynamics. First, if political leadership feels their authority is being challenged, they might take actions specifically to reassert control, even if those actions are militarily questionable. And second, if military professionals successfully constrain one type of escalation, political leadership might seek alternative escalation paths that don't require military compliance, cyber operations, covert actions, economic warfare. Third, and this is crucial, command confusion during a crisis is dangerous. If NATO believes Russian forces will behave one way based on military logic, but political leadership overrides military judgment at the last moment, you get miscalculation scenarios. And for countries in Russia's near abroad, this dynamic has immediate implications. If Russian military leadership is currently more cautious about confrontation with NATO, that potentially creates a window where deterrence is more stable. However, if that changes, either because political leadership reasserts control or because military assessments shift, the security calculus changes quickly. And what I find interesting from a strategic perspective, countries like Poland, the Baltic states, and Romania are likely watching this closely to assess how much confidence they can place in Russia, as military being a moderating voice versus a potentially aggressive one if they believe they've identified exploitable vulnerabilities. Belenja, so where does this go from here? Let me outline what I'll be watching. The most likely near-term outcome in my assessment is that this becomes part of Russia's internal decision-making process without exploding into a public crisis. The general's professional assessments get factored in, some plans get modified, and we see more cautious Russian positioning relative to NATO. And what to watch for: changes in Russian force deployments near NATO borders, shifts in rhetoric from Russian military officials versus political leaders, and whether Russia pursues diplomatic off-ramps more actively. Alternatively, if Putin or the political leadership feels their authority is being undermined, we might see moves to reassert control, potentially including leadership changes, reorganizations, or even deliberately provocative actions designed to force military compliance. Don't know what to watch for: unexpected command shuffles, increased political oversight of military operations, or escalatory actions that seem to contradict military logic. More broadly, this could represent a longer-term evolution in Russian civil-military thought relations where professional military voice gains more weight in decision-making. That would that would be significant for predicting Russian behavior in future crises. Ben's what to watch for: changes in how Russian military doctrine gets developed, whether military officials become more public in their assessments, and how defense budgets and priorities shift. Al Mingio, from NATO's perspective, the key question is whether to view this as an opportunity to press advantage or a delicate situation requiring careful management. In my analysis, NATO will likely continue its current approach of clear deterrence messaging, while avoiding actions that could force Russia into corner-backed escalation. I expect we'll have more clarity within the next 4 to 8 weeks. Russian military planning operates on seasonal, and decisions about spring and summer operational postures are typically made in this time frame. If we see significant changes in force disposition or a shift in Russian strategic messaging, that will tell us how this internal debate resolved. Ban's one final thought on what to watch: intelligence leaks. The fact that we know about this debate at all suggests someone wants it public, whether that's Western intelligence signaling, Russian internal factions positioning, or genuine security breaches, who's leaking and what they're emphasizing will tell us a lot about the underlying dynamics. Let's bring this together with 3 key takeaways. First, the reported pushback by Russian generals suggests that professional military assessment is playing a role in constraining potentially risky escalation, at least for now. That's significant for near-term stability, even if the underlying tensions remain. Second, NATO's approach of communicating detailed threat assessments directly to military professionals represents an evolution in deterrence strategy that could have implications far beyond this immediate situation. And a third, the real story here isn't any single event, but the ongoing evolution of power dynamics within Russia's decision-making system. How this tension between military professional judgment and political directives resolves will shape Russian behavior for months or years to come. Remember, we're analyzing based on available information, and the situation remains fluid. Lendeder, now I want to hear from you. Do you think military professionals should have more influence on political decisions during conflicts, or does that create its own risks? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one, and they genuinely shape how I think about these issues. Hit that like button. It really helps the channel reach more people interested in serious geopolitical analysis. And subscribe if you haven't already, because we've got more deep dives coming on developing situations in Eastern Europe and beyond. On the next video, we're looking at this from the other side, NATO's strategic calculations and what alliance decision makers are thinking right now. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one.